I am thrilled to welcome all of you to the 2025 Children's Literature Lecture with award-winning author Kyle Lukoff. I would like to begin by thanking the Association of Library Services for Children for selecting Multnomah County Library to host this year's Children's Literature Lecture. It is an honor to host this important event, and particularly this year, with author Kyle Lukoff, whose book, Call Me Max, has been banned from libraries across the country. Multnomah County Library stands firmly in support of the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights and strongly resists censorship in all its forms. Woo! We proudly carry books and materials that reflect the identities, lives, and experiences of queer and trans people, and we embrace diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at the core of what we do. We welcome all at our libraries, and we work hard to create library spaces and services that are inclusive and accessible for our entire community, particularly those who are most impacted by systems of oppression. I am proud to be here this evening to celebrate children's literature and the importance of Kyle Lukoff's works in the lives of so many young people and adults in our communities. I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to everyone who helped make this evening possible. Thank you most especially to our Multnomah County Library staff who coordinated this evening's event, particularly Sarah Ryan, Jackie Parch, Natasha Forrester Campbell, Alec Chen, and Danielle Jones for your amazing work to make tonight happen. Thank you so much to the ALSC Children's Literature Lecture Committee who selected Multnomah County Library as the host site for this year's event. Thank you also to the staff at the Association for Library Services for Children, especially Director Elena Rivers and Deputy Director Sarah Paulin. Thank you also to Summer Ogata from Penguin Young Readers and to the many organizations that are listed in your program who helped make this event possible. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Robert Bittner, President of the Association of Library Services for Children.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Bittner. I am proud to be the president of the Association for Library Service to Children, a division of the American Library Association. Welcome to the 2025 Children's Literature Lecture. Every year, ALSC invites an author, critic, librarian, historian, or teacher of children's literature of any country to prepare and present a paper considered to be a significant contribution to the field of children's literature, a very small task. Since 1969, lovers of children's literature have gathered for this prestigious lecture, which originated as a tribute to May Hill Arbuthnot, an esteemed author, editor, critic, anthologist, and educator. These lectures have been given by familiar names such as Maurice Sendak, Virginia Hamilton, Pat Mora, Jacqueline Woodson, Naomi Shihab Nye, Rita Williams Garcia, and tonight, Kyle Lukoff. The duty of selecting the annual lecturer, as well as the site for the lecture, falls on our brilliant ALSC committees, or one of our brilliant ALSC committees, and this year's committee members are Chair Jenna Friebel, Paris Kelvakis, Ruth Tabor, Janet Weber, and Lucinda Whitehurst. Members of the committee, if you're able to join us in person, please stand and be recognized. We are so thankful to have Multnomah County Library hosting the lecture this year at the lovely Judy. Multnomah, along with their many community partners, have been enjoying and celebrating Kyle's work throughout the spring in preparation for tonight's event. And now I'll begin by introducing Kyle. Kyle Lukoff is a rather remarkable human being and one who really needs no introduction, so I will keep this brief. I first met Kyle around the time that he was serving as a juror on the Stonewall Book Awards Committee, back around 2016. I remember meeting him in the exhibits hall at an ALA and being so excited to share stories about my own time on that committee. and hearing about his aspirations, which at the time included an idea for what came to be a storytelling of ravens. And now, not only has he published well over a dozen books, he's also received a Stonewall Honor for When Aidan Became a Brother, and his novel Too Bright to See became a Stonewall winner a few years later, along with being recognized with a Newbery Honor. It is safe to say at this point that since I first met Kyle, he has become, and I am not exaggerating when I say this, seriously prolific. In making their selection for this year's lecture, the Children's Literature Lecture Award Committee highlighted not only Kyle's extensive publishing history over a relatively short period of time, but also his ability to speak to a child audience without ever speaking down to them. His respect for child readers is evident in each and every book he writes. His books are each one of a kind, unique, showcasing his versatility as an artist. Kyle is truly a force of nature, using his books to help young people develop empathy and widen their perspectives in the face of an unstable world. And it is with that in mind that I am excited and honored to be able to introduce to you the one, the only, Kyle Lukoff.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to see me tonight. First, I want to say that if there are any children in the audience, if you start to feel bored after a while, it will not hurt my feelings if you want to go outside and run around and play in the lobby. I'm going to be talking for a long time, and that might start to feel boring, and that won't hurt my feelings. If you are a grown-up and you start to feel bored, that might hurt my feelings, but also, that's fine. You get to make your own choices. I want to express my immense gratitude for this honor. My profound thanks go out to the 2024 Children's Literature Lecture Award Committee, who somehow chose me for this. I'm also so grateful to my most excellent hosts, the Multnomah County Library System, as well as all of their community partners. Danielle Jones, who's sitting somewhere, was the first one to tell me of this location, not too long after it was announced, on a phone call with a mutual friend. And if I'm not wrong, I think Sarah Ryan, who's all the way back there, played a huge role in helping make this happen. Sarah, of course, is the author of the groundbreaking young adult novel Empress of the World, and also holds the distinction of being the first author I ever organized an event for, back when I was a 17-year-old lesbian. I emailed them through their website asking if they would come to the Barnes & Noble that I worked at. I promised that members of my high school's brand new GSA would come, and I told them that my dad would make them dinner. I also invited a columnist from the Seattle Times to come, both to dinner and also the event. I was a very ambitious 17-year-old, and not much has changed aside from the fact that I'm no longer a lesbian. Some of you may have seen or heard me refer to this as the Homework Award, which might sound like an insult, but I promise that that moniker came about very honestly. The day I found out I was being given this recognition, the first person I told was my husband, who is only vicariously in this world. I was struggling to explain it to him, what it was, why I was so excited, and I described it as an award, like this huge honor where I got to write a speech and then give it somewhere to be determined, and then it should be a significant contribution to the field of children's literature. I said, so basically it's like homework, except it's also an award. It's like a homework award. I will probably refer to it as the Homework Award for the rest of my life. And so far, everyone that I've explained it to has agreed with me. Even people who already understand what a big deal it is agree that yes, it is in fact a homework award. It's also probably worth noting that I loved homework as a child. I did not have a lot of friends or a lot of extracurricular activities, so homework gave me a way to fill up a lot of empty hours. It's probably a big part of why I love being a full-time writer, because my entire life is homework. I do now have friends, but I will forever associate homework with feeling safe. So I am personally and like extra grateful for this additional and momentous assignment. One person I did not think earlier is Chris Biss-Brown, the curator of the Children's Literature Research Center at the Free Library of Philadelphia. Chris got me copies of the original Children and Books textbook, authored by Nahal Arbuthnot from 1947, as well as the collected speeches from 1970 to 1989. I spent 3 afternoons in the collection reading the textbook and the collected speeches, not to mention all of the speeches available online, because I decided that I wanted a thorough understanding of this thing I was being asked to do, and because I love homework. Today I'm going to cover two broad topics. I'm going to put my water here. First, I want to discuss something that children's books are often asked to do, and why I am beginning to resist that request. Then I want to posit a theory about what I think children's books are doing and what that means. And can everyone hear me okay in this room? Excellent. When I refer to children's books, unless I am being more specific, it is safe to assume that I'm referring to a wide spectrum of literature, from board books up through middle grade or even young adult novels, especially fiction, but not always or specifically so. Because this is a speech bounded by our attention spans and my own voice, I will sometimes revert to somewhat broad strokes, but of course I know there are always exceptions to everything that I'm about to say. And on the topic of the Homework Award itself. Like I said, I spent a fair amount of time reading Mayhill Arbuthnot's textbook, Children and Books, the original edition from 1942. Although I say back here it was 1947. That's a typo. One of you can figure out if it was 1942 or 1947. It's one of those. It was a lot of fun. So the wit and personality present in just the textbook itself makes me wish that I had gotten a chance to meet her. I think we would have gotten along, and at the points where we disagree, I think we might have had some fruitful discussions. She devotes chapter 2 of the textbook to history and trends in children's books. She spends some time on early American literacy and history, talking about hornbooks and battledores, which, quote, in general were designed to teach the child his letters and their combinations, and to continue his religious instruction. She goes on to conclude that these early primers never, quote, carried anything that was even remotely entertaining, so the children still sampled what they could from adult books. Progressing in history, she goes on to chapbooks, cheaply printed stories of adventure, lamenting that, quote, the attitude of serious-minded adults of the day toward these crude, often vulgar little books was generally scornful. However, she notes a bit later that, quote, badly written, crudely illustrated, unhonored though they were, the chapbooks preserved and popularized some of the precious elements of literature that children love. But their coarseness probably paved the way for the reaction against tales, stories, and jests, the reaction which produced children's books full of somber warnings and doleful examples. Something I really appreciate about children and books, and a big part of why I think Arbuthnot and I would have gotten along, is that she seems deeply committed to the belief that children are children, which is to say people of a particular age with particular needs who should be met where they are and who should be met where they're at and respected as they are. And entwined with that is the belief that literature for children, which is to say literature for people of a particular age with particular needs, should appeal to that self-same audience by their own lights and on their own terms. Simply put, they should like it. These books should not only exist to teach them how to read so they can go on to read boring legal and financial documents. This literature does not only exist to prepare them morally, ethically, and religiously for a homogeneous and serious world. Mayhill Arbuthnot seemed dedicated to the belief that the purpose of literature for children is not to prepare children to become the right kind of adult, but rather to entertain, delight, enliven, and mystify children as they already exist within the bounds of their fleeting, temporary childhood. Books for children, she thought, should honor that period of life, not try to get it over with as quickly as possible. I was so amused reading Children and Books by the little jabs she made here and there at didactic books, the kind of stories full of obvious morals and clear intentions. She refers to, quote, long interludes of theological moralizing in Pilgrim's Progress as obstructions to be cleared away. She explains that some older fables, quote, are enjoyed by young people even if they do skip the morals. In talking about, quote, the good godly books of the Puritans, she posits that these dull texts, quote, must have developed in the children for whom they were intended, either a lively resistance to books in general, or a still livelier search for a comforting chapbook. I won't go too much deeper into the early American and European histories of children's books, but lastly I want to read to you a bit from a section titled Didacticism in France and England. Here, Arbuthnot says that some authors, quote, began to write painfully didactic stories, sometimes to teach religion, sometimes to inform and educate, In these deadly books of theirs, if a poor child picked strawberries, the experience was turned into an arithmetic lesson. If he rolled a snowball, he learned about levers and proceeded from those to wedges. If he took a walk, he had to observe every beast, stone, and occupation of man. Day and night, these ardent authors stalked their children, never allowing a moment for play or fancy, but instructing and improving on every page. No longer did they threaten the child with the fear of hell, but the pressure of information hung almost as heavily over his hapless head. Okay, that last passage is not a little jab. It is more like a call to arms. She hated didacticism. I think for Arbuthnot, that might have been one of the worst insults you could apply to a book. And I am confident that an overwhelming number of authors and children's literature professionals today would agree with her. No one wants to read a book that hits readers over the head with a simplistic message like a sledgehammer. Everyone wants to write a book that hits readers in the heart, in the soul, in the imagination, not a book that imperiously tells someone what to do and what to think. I have, however, for quite a while now noticed what I think might be a new form of didacticism creeping into children's books. And despite the fact that my books about trans kids have been banned by entire states and been on a stage with a Republican governor, despite the fact that I've been called a trailblazer and a boundary breaker, not to mention certain other slurs, this is the first idea that I've ever felt nervous about putting into a public space. But the point of the Homework Award is to make a significant contribution to the field of children's literature, and there is something I need to get off my chest. I want to talk about empathy. Doing the whole "the dictionary defines empathy" thing makes me feel like a high school junior trying to fill space on a paper, but I do think it is worth defining terms so that you all know what I'm talking about when I use that word. And if this were the kind of presentation I normally give, I would engage with the audience to create a shared definition of the term, or at least I would know what some of you understood the term empathy to mean, and this would be a more collaborative process. But because this is also being published relatively verbatim, minus any spontaneous asides, I don't think that process will work, so you're stuck with my definition. And speaking of spontaneous asides, can everyone turn to the cameras and wave at my parents who are watching? Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Love you. Thanks for giving me books. Okay. I am talking about empathy as I see it broadly understood in the context of literature for youth. This idea that you can understand and even feel another person's experience if you read about a well-rendered example. That reading about a person who is different from you will help you internalize what that difference feels like, and that the internalization of someone else's feelings will guide your response moving forward. Empathy in this context means that your emotional response largely mirrors that of the person you're reading about, and that it might help you know how to act in the future. When I type children's books about empathy, I get over 58 million hits delivered in less than 1 second. There are books that teach empathy on Common Sense Media, which describes the concept thus: empathic kids can put themselves in someone else's shoes. It also allows them to develop other caring character strengths, such as compassion and gratitude. These great books for all ages help make it easier by celebrating friendship, difference, and the importance of caring for one another. There are empathy-building books for kids on PBS, similar articles from countless publishers, news sources, and teacher resources. Some are blunt. A kid's book about empathy, which says, quote, "Feelings aren't always easy, especially when they are other people's. This book teaches kids and grown-ups how to feel with someone, not just for them." There's I Am Human, a book about empathy, and Empathy is My Superpower. Countless other books might not have such clear and unambiguous titles, but are putting forth that message anyway. Heck, this past November, I was on a panel about empathy in picture books organized by an educator I respect, alongside authors whose books I love. These titles are legion. Many of them I adore, others I like less, but they are all trying to do the same thing, to use the written word to get young readers to consider experiences that they may or may not have had and to encourage them to respond with kindness. I am not against empathy, but I am starting to have questions about this. The first query I want to raise is the utility, artistic or otherwise, of writing a book with the express and stated goal of evoking a specific and particular emotional response in your readers. I got hired at Barnes & Noble when I was 16 and worked there off and on for the next 10 years. I loved it because it combined two of my favorite things: putting things in alphabetical order and talking to people about books. By the time I went to library school at the age of 26, I had been taking readers' advisory I had been having readers' advisory conversations with people for a decade. Then I spent the next 8 years as an elementary school librarian, talking to children about what books they liked, what they didn't like, what they thought and felt about the books I recommended to them, and the ones they chose at random. Now that I'm a full-time writer, a huge part of my job is still talking to people about books, which ones they like and which ones they don't, what their interpretations and opinions and emotional reactions are. And now, a lot of the books that people tell me about are the ones I wrote, the ones I know inside and out, the ones where I put care and craft into every word. So when someone says to me about my book, Too Bright to See, I think there was a mean ghost in Bug's house and Uncle Roderick's ghost helped defeat it. I could respond in one of two ways. I could respond like a writer and say, oh, no, there's just one nice ghost. Or I could respond like a librarian at a bookseller and say, oh, wow, that's such an interesting theory. Why do you think that? Or when I'm on a school visit and I ask kids why Aidan wears differently gendered outfits in different scenes, I could tell kids that they're wrong when they posit that Aidan is feeling gender fluid, or maybe he's trying to set a good example for a fetus. Or I could say, that's one idea. Why do you think he might do that? I, of course, always choose the latter option. It's the only fair response. While I don't believe that the author is dead, I'm right here, I do believe that once I put a book in someone's hands, that book becomes theirs to interpret as they see fit. Stories should not be political manifestos. They are not careful spellings out of articulate rights and wrongs with correct interpretations and wrong ones. Books are relationships. They are a relationship between the writer and themselves, as expressed through a story. They are a relationship between the reader and the text, and they are a relationship between the reader and themselves, as mediated through their independent interpretation of that story. Books can help you learn about other people, but they always help you learn about yourself. Writers are often asked, what do you hope a reader takes away from your book? What lessons do we want them to learn? What emotional response do we want them to have? I've never come up with a gracious answer to this question, and usually revert to flapping my hands and saying, I don't know, I hope you like it, but if you don't, that's okay. While there is nothing wrong with empathy itself, I am suspicious of what I see as a larger project to write books with the explicit intent of engendering empathy. That, to me, is an arrogant goal contrary to the larger purpose of telling a story. You never know who your reader is. You never know what their takeaway is going to be. In a simple story about standing up to a bully, you might have kids who empathize with the victim. You might have kids who empathize with the bully. You might have kids who decide to imitate the bully because sometimes kids try out things they see in books. I once had a 6-year-old call me a sissy after we read Oliver Button is A. And when I asked him why he used that word, he said it was funny, so he wanted to try it. I decided that that was not going to be a teaching moment about how I am, in fact, a sissy, and about the reclamation of homophobic language. And I said, after I said something along the lines of like, the kids in that book used that word to hurt his feelings, were you trying to hurt my feelings? He just like shrugged with a not very contrite smile on his face and ran off. I'm not sure if that lesson stuck. Also, this might be a tangent, but one of my regular refrains used to be that every book is about empathy. When parents would come into my library looking for something that would help their child develop that particular response, I would tell them that any book could do that job if you asked the right question. Since every book is about someone who, by definition, is not you, and every book is about things happening to those people who aren't you, literally any book is about experiencing those things through another person's perspective. With any story, you could ask a kid, a reader, yourself, how is that character feeling? Why do you think they are feeling that way? How would you feel if that happened to you? Which is not the same thing as empathy because you are imagining yourself, the whole catalog of who you are and what you've been through in the fictional shoes of a not real person, but it's a start, especially if your answers to those questions are not what the author intended. So I'm generally suspicious of any attempts to make a reader feel something specific. People are weird and unpredictable, and part of the joy of writing is seeing what bonkers takes people have about your work. There's another element of empathy-forward books that I want to challenge next, assuming that I haven't lost all of your goodwill. Some of my earliest and most potent memories are of the picture books I loved as a young child. There are a particular few that resonated strongly with me, so much so that reading them today brings me back to being a tiny person cross-legged on someone's lap. Two that I'm thinking of right now are Hazel's Amazing Mother by Rosemary Wells and I'll Fix Anthony by Judith Viorst. If you're not familiar, both of these books could be subtitled a revenge fantasy. In Hazel's Amazing Mother, Hazel is a somewhat irresponsible child who goes off to run errands for her mom, gets lost, gets attacked and disheveled by bullies. Her mom, through some magical sixth sense, realizes that her daughter is in danger, and a powerful localized storm sweeps her away into the same tree that Hazel is being menaced under. Hazel's mother terrifies and intimidates the bullies, forcing them to right everything they've wronged, and finally, the unredeemed trio run off blubbering in fear. This book evoked so many emotions in me. I remember feeling very angry at Hazel for ignoring her mom's directions and foolishly getting lost. I also remember feeling terrified because as a very young child, the idea of getting lost scared me beyond measure. I remember feeling a murderous rage toward the bullies and a deep sense of satisfaction when they got their comeuppance. I had little to no empathy for Hazel while she was being bullied. We are not asked to empathize with the bullies. We don't know why they are who they are, what trauma they carry with them, what happens to them after. All we know is that they are bad kids who need to be dominated into a snotty, tearful defeat. My mom, no doubt, was drawn to the theme of a mother's superhuman, unconditional love, but I just liked seeing some bad kids get what was coming to them. I'll Fix Anthony dwells even more in gleeful violence. Illustrated by Arnold Lobel, the end papers of the edition I had as a child had a racist caricature of Anthony dressed up like the worst stereotype of a Native American, feathers, etc. As I said in other contexts, I do wish I had been given fewer racist stereotypes as a child that I had to later unlearn as an adult. I will touch on this briefly later. The rest of I'll Fix Anthony is about a young child with a cartoonishly cruel older brother. The unnamed narrator tells us that when he's 6, he'll fix Anthony, which looks like a series of petty humiliations and minor acts of cruelty and humiliation. I also had a big brother, but unlike this child, he and I had a very good relationship. He was pretty nice to me most of the time, and I don't remember having any fantasies of violence towards him, but still. I was a small, powerless person, generally surrounded by large people who only respected my autonomy when it was convenient for them. I remember thinking to myself, yes, when I'm 6, everything will be different. I didn't have a particular Anthony that I wanted to fix because my version of Anthony was the entire world. That book helped me exorcise my own anger, my own impotence, and allowed me to revel, albeit briefly, in the feeling of superiority. One more book I want to bring up is so controversial that I really had to hesitate before talking about it, but this book had such a huge impact on my emotional reality as a child that to leave it unacknowledged would be a crime of omission. I'm referring to The Giving Tree. Shel Silverstein, of course. I could write an entire different speech about this book, and I have, in fact. That's for another day if you want to invite me. But for now, the reason it is relevant is not because I want to prove any particular point to you about its objective merits, but rather because regardless of what anyone else thinks about it, this book made me feel something in a way that nothing else had before, and possibly nothing else has since. When I read this book as, again, a very young child, it introduced me to the complex shades of a relationship where there is love and also hurt, where you can want something very badly and then not know what to do when you get it. It would be many, many years before I entered into my first unhealthy relationship with a man who wanted me to give him everything and gave me the honor of his distracted presence in return. But even as a little kid, I knew that someday I would feel like the tree, and other days I would feel like the boy, and I in turn would make others feel like their own trees and boys as well. This book did not make me want to treat people better, and it did not provide enough of a warning that I could avoid some terrible relationships in the future. This book did not do anything so simple as inspire empathy toward the specific goal of making me nicer to other people. This book helped me identify a resonant strain of human emotion that I had not known how to name before, and gave me a touchstone to come back to time and time again over the past 35-odd years. Because I think books intentionally about empathy are also about something else. I think they are usually about kindness, which I'm not sure if I would call that an emotion, an action, a quality, or a feeling, but it does overlap with all of those things. I'm not coming out against kindness either. I think kindness is good. It is important. It is a way I try to act. a set of behaviors and responses I try to cultivate. It is a way that I feel oftentimes, but prioritizing kindness over any other possible response, anger, grief, selfishness, frustration, is so limiting. If all I had as a young person was an unending stream of books about nice people being nice to each other, I would have felt so alone because I had all these other feelings. I wanted to hurt the people who hurt me. I loved things that could never love me back. I wanted to compare myself to my peers and either feel proud of myself for succeeding where they failed or berate myself for falling short. Even as a young child, I was a whole and entire human being with the capacity for a full and robust range of emotions, and I wanted all of myself to be validated by the stories I read. While empathy and its attendant kindnesses are valuable messages, those alone do not make for a healthy emotional diet. I worry that prioritizing so-called positive emotions over all others can lead to stunted development, to a pathological fear of anything unpleasant, and to the dishonesty that must follow. Because if you cannot be honest with yourself about how you feel, how can you be honest about anything else? The last point I want to explore is about the value of empathy itself. There's one excellent book I'd like to recommend on the topic called Against Empathy, which I am not again, but it is a book by Paul Bloom. I won't be recreating his arguments here. They are worth engaging with. I've been thinking for months about how to coalesce his careful unpicking of the subject with my own gut instincts and landing upon a distillation of both. The concept of empathy as it exists in children's books is taken as an unambiguous good. Putting yourself in someone's shoes, thinking about how someone else might feel, must always then lead to more understanding and compassion. That may or may not be true, but even if it is true, without exception, I've started to wonder if empathy itself is a tool, and then if, like all tools, it is morally neutral. Perhaps it is not a good thing, and it is not a bad thing. Maybe it is simply one way that a person could interpret the world, and then, like any neutral tool, technology, speech acts, protests, the use to which it is put is largely a question of power. Who you are being asked to empathize with is, of course, a question of power. Children's literature has always been a site of struggle in that regard, as an all-white canon is slowly diversified, as boys might be asked to read about girls instead of always the other way around, as groups of human beings consistently relegated to a subhuman other are demanding positive representation. This is a good thing. Or, to be more accurate, this is a political movement that is in line with my values, so it is one that I support. But within Dr. Udine Sims Bishop's framework of windows and mirrors, I suppose I'm coming out in favor of the self-interrogatory mirror, rather than the empathetic window. One could draw out that metaphor further, asking about two-way mirrors, windows that birds break their necks on, funhouse mirrors, and sliding glass doors that you can't figure out how to unlock, but that's something to explore another day. But if empathizing with a diverse group of people is a political project, so was the enshrinement of this country's hierarchies of privilege in the publishing lists of the past. The question I have is not whether it is good or bad to be asked to empathize through books, but rather who we are being asked to empathize with. That question, that tool, is not neutral. In Debbie Reese's excellent 2019 lecture, she reminds us that, quote, if we think about it, every children's book for which the setting is this continent is set on what used to be native lands. If we could all hold that fact front and center every time we pick up a children's book set on this continent, how might that change how we view children's literature? How might that shape the literature as we move into the future? I don't know, and it's hard to think about, but I want to think about it. I think we should think about that. Which also means, of course, that I wrote this speech on what used to be native lands, first in Philadelphia on Lenape-Hoking territory, and then in Connecticut on Nipmuc land, and I'm giving it here under the auspices of a library system named for the Multnomah people. Dr. Reese is right that this is hard to think about, and that it is something we should be thinking about, but this is too big of a problem for empathy alone to solve. And that leads to another question. What are you being asked to do with your empathy? If you deeply empathize with a bully, that might make it harder to hold them accountable because feeling what they're feeling could in turn justify their actions. Empathizing with a racist character might make racism seem like an understandable emotional response rather than an ideology baked into systems that must be dismantled. The school library I worked in for years only had books on the shelf that encouraged children to empathize with police officers. And after a few years, I had to remove most of them because I could not balance them with other age-appropriate material about empathizing with the experience of being harmed by the police. Empathy is not a neutral goal in and of itself. We should always be asking the question of who we are being asked to empathize with and what we are being asked to do with that empathy. Now, to be clear, I am not now calling for a new didacticism. I do not want children's books to move away from empathetic portrayals of individuals into unambiguous calls for systemic change. That's what manifestos are for, and some zines and editorials. I have an old gallery of Unlondon, the first middle grade novel by author China Mieville. In the back of this arc is an interview, and one of the questions is, how do your political convictions intersect with your literary and artistic ambitions? He says both completely and not at all. Completely because my political convictions are an inextricable part of how I see the world, of which the stories I write are also an expression. Not at all because I know that my job when I write fiction isn't to make a certain political point, but to keep the reader interested in the story, the characters, the weird, that they can keep turning the pages whether they agree, disagree, or couldn't care less about my politics. So the paradox is, a key to successfully writing political fiction is precisely to make it good fiction. If the politics are great but the fiction doesn't work, then it fails as fiction and therefore is political fiction too. Which is great because if it succeeds as fiction, then even if you aren't interested in the politics, it has still hopefully worked for you. There's nothing I hate more than a book I agree with from a political perspective but despise on an aesthetic level. The message should serve the story, not the other way around. So if I don't believe that children's books should come at the reader with a particular informational or political message, and if I'm not especially interested in the overarching project of empathy, what exactly do I want from the loosely defined field that is children's literature? I want it to be exactly what it is. I want it to honor, serve, entertain, delight, enliven, and mystify children as they already exist within the bounds of their fleeting temporary childhood. Mayhill Arbuthnot clearly believed the children's book should honor that period of life, not try to get it over with as quickly as possible, and I agree with that with all my heart. One fascinating aspect of children's books, and one way that they differ dramatically from material aimed at adults, is that you can see each state of literature as a metaphor for human development from infancy through early childhood up through adolescence. Take board books like that one. Those books intended for the youngest of audiences. In order to work, they need to be simple and basic, but masking a greater complexity, much like the first days and weeks of life, of being alive from the infant's perspective and trying to keep them alive from a caregiver's perspective. Black and white supposedly help babies' eyes focus and are also the most simple colors, and also the metaphorical and physical properties of black and white are complex beyond imagining. Many of them rhyme, and the best ones have a consistent and strict scansion, which mimics a walking pace, swaying a beating heart. Babies love looking at other babies, hence the popularity of photographs in their books, and it's not uncommon for a story to end with a mirror, which then gets into Freudian analysis as well as the larger philosophical question of what it means to see oneself. Lives of very young children are bounded by their physical needs, crying, eating, pooping, sleeping, waking up. The simplest and most basic of structures, the ones that exist for all of us before social conditioning sets in, which is why board books do best when they mirror that simplicity, that structure, and take the form of something a child knows best, the iambs of a heartbeat and the rhythm of the breath, the complexity of the entire world, hidden within the most mundane of frameworks, just like the reality and potential that simultaneously exist within a newly born body. When a child graduates to picture books, though, the possibilities are endless, just like childhood. But also, just like childhood, those endless possibilities need certain supports and structures if they are to reach their full potential. In my favorite passage from A Wrinkle in Time, Mrs. Watson explains what a sonnet is to an impatient Calvin. It is a very strict form of poetry, is it not? There are 14 lines, I believe, all in iambic pentameter. That's a very strict rhythm or meter, yes? And each line has to end with a rigid rhyme pattern. And if the poet does not do it exactly this way, it is not a sonnet, is it? But within this strict form, the poet has complete freedom to say whatever he wants, doesn't he? Yes, Calvin nodded again. So, Mrs. Whatsit said. So what? Oh, do not be stupid, boy, Mrs. Whatsit scolded. You know perfectly well what I'm driving at. You mean you're comparing our lives to a sonnet? A strict form but freedom within it? Yes, Mrs. Whatsit said. You are given the form, but you have to write the sonnet yourself. What you say is completely up to you. Whenever I teach classes on how to write picture books, I try to indoctrinate my students into the theory that picture books are more closely related to formalist poetry than any other type of literature. My favorite picture books are more easily compared to the interlocking end words of a sestina, the plotted repetition of a villanelle, or the careful meter of a Shakespearean sonnet, volta and all, rather than simply a short story told in simple words or, God forbid, basic rhyming couplets. I love to ask students to identify the organizing structure of When Aidan Became a Brother and watch their eyes widen when I pick out for them the repetition used throughout, which neatly inverts at a crucial moment in the story. The best picture books tell full, complex, layered stories that seem simple, but are as full of finely tuned inner workings as a vintage watch. This, to me, is also the best representation of childhood, an age of both complete chaos and strict routines, where the echoes of babyhood and toddlerdom still come through at expected and unexpected moments. People who seem easy to talk to because they don't know as many words as you do, but that's what makes them so hard to communicate with. A sight of endless promise that can be best realized when given a strong framework. Here I'm going to skip over two kinds of children's books that are of profound importance but have less metaphorical implications as far as I can tell. That is to say, early readers and early chapter books. These, I think, are the hardest of all possible books to get right because, unlike picture books, you cannot rely upon an adult reader to parse through tricky words and complex sentence structures, but you also need to get kids themselves to enjoy reading them if they're going to continue to develop a love of reading. One could spin some theory about how these first steps towards independence can look like a regression, how 6- and 7-year-olds are like the middle schoolers of elementary school, with a teenager's burgeoning awareness of complex social dynamics, but the impulse control of much younger children, and how these intermediary books need to meet them where they're at, even more assiduously than other texts. But I will simply put this all down here. Maybe someday come back to it. Unfairness to early readers aside, I want to close by explaining why I try to write my novels like they were picture books. Like I said above, I believe that picture books more closely resemble received forms of poetry rather than simply stories that are shorter. I thought that moving on to novels might be a little easier because I wouldn't be so beholden to strict structures and form. But, unfortunately, I think I am a picture book author who also writes novels, as opposed to the other way around. I think I'm also a picture book author who also writes speeches and essays, to be honest, instead of just a writer who writes all kinds of things. The careful piecing together of consistently developed elements permeates my writing as best as I can manage it, because to me, that is where the magic in a story resides. I think more novels for adults would benefit from a picture book-like approach, to be honest. I think most artists on some level agree with me, even if they don't know what they're doing. Ursula Le Guin, for example, wrote in her novel, The Dispossessed, quote, "If you can see a thing whole, it seems that it's always beautiful. Planets, lives, but up close, a world's all dirt and rocks. And day-to-day life's a hard job. You get tired, you lose the pattern. You need distance, interval. The way to see how beautiful Earth is to see it from the moon. The way to see how beautiful life is from the vantage point of death." Or, I would argue, from the vantage point of a story, that remove that can only come from fiction, and the pattern recognition that becomes possible when you are liberated from simply listing things that happen and are allowed to weave them into a narrative. In his advice column, Hola Papi, writer J.P. Brammer advises a lonely woman that, quote, "When we look at the facts of our lives, and when we have too much time on our hands, we tend to make constellations. That's human, but sometimes we get so familiar with the shapes we've made that we forget we made them in the first place, and they begin to look like plain old reality." The best stories, I think, are those that can isolate elements of a life, of a narrative, and draw dazzling connections between them. The final product may be constructed from intentionally and carefully chosen plot points, but it looks like infinite possibility. Just like, again, the single life we are each given. What I want, in short, is for children's books to be bounded in a nutshell and then counted a realm of infinite space. That's Hamlet. I do not want the bounds of children's literature to be a particular moral bent, or for it to be confined by the expectation that they improve children intellectually or ethically. Just like children are not vessels for future adults, neither should the art we give them be didactically bent toward molding them into whatever the current power structure deems best. What I want is for the boundaries of children's literature to be like the stars that we make constellations out of, the complex connections we make between words and ideas, and the infinite space to be the full potential of storytelling. Thank you. I said no Q&A, so I don't know what happens next. What happens next? I walk away.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for that amazing speech. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Some came locally, some came from afar. We have our lovely local indie bookstore, Honey Words, here.